The night of September 14th, 1973, fell heavy and humid over Harmony Creek, Alabama. On the edge of town, in the warren of clapboard houses shadowed by the hulking textile mill, Earl Pritchett was climbing a fence. He was 48 years old, drunk, and craving one of the sweet, sun-ripened peaches that grew in the widow Ruby Vance's backyard. Everyone knew she had the best peaches in the county, the best cornbread, and the hottest brick oven. Earl landed with a soft thud in the dusty yard, freezing to listen. Silence. No, not silence. He could hear something. A sound his liquor-soaked brain couldn't quite place. A scuffling, a heavy breathing, and a smell, a strange smell. Not dough, not wood smoke, but something else entirely. Earl crept along the wall of the small house. The moon slid out from behind a thick cloud, and he saw them. 3 women, Ruby Vance and 2 of her neighbors. They were standing around the big brick oven in the backyard. The heat radiating from it was so intense that Earl could feel it on his face from 50 feet away. But the oven was roaring in the middle of the night. Why? Ruby always baked at dawn. And then he saw it. Something long, something that the 2 other women held at each end. Something they were slowly, carefully feeding into the glowing clay maw. Earl Pritchett sobered up in a single, heart-stopping second. He doesn't remember vaulting back over the fence. He doesn't remember his frantic sprint through the dark, unpaved streets. He only remembers bursting into the sheriff's office, stuttering, his words tangled with terror. The night deputy was about to throw the town drunk out, but Earl said one thing, just one phrase, that made the deputy slowly put down his pen, pick up the telephone, and place a long-distance call to the state capitol in Montgomery. 3 days later, state investigator David Sterling would arrive in Harmony Creek, a veteran who had seen the frozen hell of the Battle of the Bulge, a man who thought he had seen everything evil had to offer. He was wrong. What he would find buried beneath the old brick oven in the widow's yard would rob him of sleep for 2 weeks. What he would uncover about the events of the last 6 years would be sealed in the state's classified archives, marked not for public disclosure. 9 men, 9 missing persons cases gone cold. 9 people searched for years and never found, because there was nothing left to find. Ruby Vance's oven worked flawlessly. At 750 degrees Fahrenheit, the human body is reduced to ash in a matter of hours. And ash, as it turns out, is an excellent fertilizer for tomatoes. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how a quiet Alabama widow became the most terrifying serial killer in the state's history, we have to go back 11 years, to 1962, to the night her husband Andrew was murdered. And something inside Ruby Vance broke forever. If you're interested in these kinds of stories from the past, the ones the papers never wrote about and people only whispered, then stay with me. This story will change everything you think you know about what an ordinary woman with a brick oven is capable of. Harmony Creek, in the early 60s, was a town of stark contrasts. On one side, you had the new brick houses of the mill supervisors, with their manicured lawns and wide, tree-lined avenues. The gleaming movie theater, the millworkers' social club with its white columns and pristine statues of American eagles. On the other side, you had the Hollow, the district of the millworkers, ramshackle houses with tin roofs, dirt yards separated by crumbling stone walls, and narrow streets where 2 cars couldn't pass. A way of life 1,000 years old, one that modern progress had failed to change. On the edge of town, near the ever-present hum of the textile mill, the Hollow lived a life of its own. Here, everyone knew everyone. Weddings were 3-day affairs, and a funeral brought the whole street out to mourn. Here, old men sat on their porches from morning till night, sipping sweet tea and watching the world go by. Here, women gossiped over clotheslines, and news traveled faster than the telephone. And here, in a small house with blue shutters and an old peach tree in the yard, lived the Vance family. Andrew Vance, 36 years old, was a first-class truck driver hauling massive spools of cotton from the Harmony Creek textile mill. He was a short, wiry man with a dark mustache and kind, smiling eyes. Everyone knew him. Andrew was the kind of man who couldn't ignore someone else's trouble. If a neighbor's car broke down, Andrew was there to fix it. If a family was short on grocery money, Andrew would lend it. If someone was sick and needed a ride to the county hospital, Andrew would drive them. His wife, Ruby, was 5 years younger. In 1962, she was 29. A small, round-faced woman with thick black braids she kept pinned up under a headscarf. She was what people called a true homemaker. Her house sparkled with cleanliness, her cornbread rose fluffy and golden, her peach pies were filled with sweet, juicy fruit and tender meat. Neighbors came to her for advice on how to get out a stubborn stain, how to can green beans, how to soothe a crying baby. But the most important person in Ruby's life was her daughter. Daisy was born in 1955, a beautiful little girl with her father's big eyes and her mother's gentle face. When she turned 1, her parents realized something was wrong. Their daughter didn't react to sounds, didn't turn her head when they called her name, didn't cry at loud noises. The doctors in Harmony Creek just shrugged. The specialists in Birmingham said the same. Deaf from birth. Incurable. In those days, children like Daisy were often sent away to state-run institutions. Ruby refused. She learned to speak to her daughter without words, through gestures, touches, and glances. By the time Daisy was 7, they understood each other better than most mothers and their talking children. Daisy grew up quiet, observant, noticing everything. She couldn't hear the world, but she saw it more sharply than anyone else. In 1962, she was 7 years old. The Vance family's life seemed simple and good. Andrew worked. Ruby kept the house. Daisy grew. In the evenings, they would sit in the yard under the peach tree, drinking coffee and eating cornbread, listening to the drone of the cicadas. But beneath this peaceful surface, a storm was brewing. In the Harmony Creek of the 60s, cotton was king. It fed the county. It provided paychecks and bonuses. It also bred a terrifying level of corruption that everyone knew about, and everyone kept quiet about. Cotton was being stolen, not by the pound, but by the ton. Falsified records hid staggering amounts of theft. Mill supervisors drove new Cadillacs and built themselves vacation homes on the lake. Foremen bought their wives gold jewelry, and the ordinary workers either kept their mouths shut or they took part in the scheme. Silas Miller was the foreman of the mill's trucking fleet, a grim-faced man of 45 with a hard stare and thick fingers. He was the nephew of the mayor of Harmony Creek, the very man who ran the entire county. Silas drank hard, he beat his wife, he took bribes, and he had organized a system for stealing cotton that was so slick, state auditors could never find a thing. He needed drivers, quiet, obedient drivers, willing to haul an unofficial load in the middle of the night for a nice cash bonus. Andrew Vance was neither quiet nor obedient. In October of 1962, Silas called Andrew into his office, a small room off the garage that stank of gasoline and stale cigar smoke. "Vance, I've got some work for you. 3 runs a week. At night. Pay is real good." Andrew knew immediately what he was talking about. Everyone at the mill knew about the night runs. "No," he said, "I'm not getting involved in that." Silas wasn't used to hearing the word no. He was the kind of man who took refusal as a personal insult. "You think about it, Vance. You've got a wife, a little girl. I hear she's sick, deaf, ain't she? The money would help." I said no. That was the first conversation. It was followed by a second, a third, a fifth. Silas pressured him, threatened to fire him, promised he'd make his life a living hell. Andrew stood his ground. He was one of those stubborn men who would rather break than bend. On the 12th of November, 1962, Andrew Vance finished his shift at 7 in the evening. He stopped by the local diner for a cup of coffee with his friends. like he did every Tuesday. He was there for an hour and left around 8. It was a 10-minute walk home. He never made it. They found him the next morning in an alley behind the diner, lying in a drainage ditch. His face was beaten beyond recognition. His ribs were shattered. The coroner counted 32 blows from a tire iron or a heavy pipe. Andrew Vance hadn't died right away. He was still alive when his body was thrown into the ditch. He had drowned in 2 feet of muddy water, unable to move from the agonizing pain. He was 36 years old. Daisy would never hear her father's voice, but she remembered his hands, large, warm, smelling of motor oil. The hands that tossed her up toward the ceiling. The hands that would never hold her again. The investigation lasted 2 weeks, or rather it pretended to last 2 weeks. Everyone knew who killed Andrew. Silas Miller wasn't even trying to hide it. At the diner, he bragged about how he had taught a lesson to someone who wouldn't listen. He laughed and drank whiskey. The men he was with nervously looked away. The sheriff's deputy came to see Ruby on the 3rd day. "We haven't found anything," he said, not looking her in the eye. "Probably some drifters, just passing through. We're looking." Ruby stared at him in silence. She already knew the truth. The neighbors had told her. The whole town knew. A week later, the case was closed. No suspects identified. Silas Miller was the mayor's nephew. That meant he was untouchable. That meant no trial, no punishment, nothing. Ruby filed a complaint with the district attorney. The complaint was lost. She wrote a letter to the state capitol. The letter went unanswered. She went to see the mayor, the killer's own uncle. She wasn't allowed past the front desk. "Calm down, woman," his secretary told her. "Go home and raise your daughter. You can't bring your husband back." Ruby walked out of the mayor's office into the cold November day. A light rain was falling. She stood on the steps and looked up at the gray sky. Something changed in her in that moment. Something broke, and at the same time, something new was born. Something cold, hard, and patient. She stopped crying completely. Not once in the next 11 years did a single person see a tear on her face. She stopped going to church. When asked why, she'd say, "God didn't hear me. Why should I talk to someone who doesn't listen?" She stopped talking to her neighbors. She would nod politely and walk away. Only with her daughter did she remain the same. Only with Daisy was there warmth, care, and silent conversations with their eyes and hands. A month after her husband's death, Ruby started baking cornbread and pies to sell. She had to live, somehow. Had to feed her daughter, had to pay for kerosene and medicine. She would get up at 4 in the morning, mix the dough flour, water, salt, a pinch of sugar, and start the fire in her brick oven. By 6 a.m., the first batch was ready. Hot, fluffy, with a crispy crust, sprinkled with sesame seeds and cumin. The mill workers, on their way to the 7 o'clock shift, would line up at her gate. Ruby's baking quickly became the best in the area. People bought it while it was still warm, wrapped in newspaper, and ate it on their way to the mill. They ordered it for weddings and funerals. The local diner bought her pies exclusively. Ruby worked in silence, giving customers a thin, polite smile that never reached her eyes. She took their money, counted their change, and said nothing. The neighbors said, "Poor woman. Grief has broken her. It happens. Time will heal her. She'll thaw out." They were wrong. Inside Ruby, nothing was thawing. Inside, something else was rising. A plan which she nurtured as patiently as the dough for her bread. Every morning, as she stoked the fire in the oven, she would stare at the glowing embers. 750 degrees. A clay oven, 5 feet deep, a heat capable of turning anything into ash. She waited. 1 year, then 2. Silas Miller lived 3 streets over. He still drank, still beat his wife, still stole cotton. Sometimes he would walk past Ruby's house and not even see her. She saw him every time. By 1965, Ruby knew everything about his habits. What time he left for work, which diner he went to, which route he took home, when he got blackout drunk. She knew that on Fridays, he drank especially heavily. and that he walked home not along the main street, but through an alley. It was shorter. She knew that there were no lights in that alley, and that no one lived there, just a windowless wall of a warehouse on one side and an abandoned house on the other. On Friday, the 5th of March, 1965, Silas Miller left the diner around 11 o'clock at night. He was drunk, as he always was on Fridays. He was walking home his usual way, through the dark alley. He never made it home. No one knows exactly how it happened. The investigation never established the details, but one can imagine. A small woman in the dark, a quiet voice. "Mr. Miller, please, help me. I feel sick." A drunken man, not expecting danger from a woman. The first blow to the back of the head with something heavy. A fall to the ground. A second blow, a third, and then a wheelbarrow, the same one Ruby used to haul flour from the market. The night streets were empty. It was a 7-minute walk to her house. The oven was waiting, red hot, ready. That night, Ruby didn't sleep. She sat by the oven until dawn, feeding it firewood, making sure the heat never dropped below the required temperature. By morning, all that was left of Silas Miller was a pile of ash. Ruby swept it out with a small shovel, scattered it in her garden under the tomato plants, spreading it evenly so there were no fresh piles. At 7 in the morning, as usual, she was selling cornbread to the workers. "You look a little pale today, Ruby," one of the customers said. "Didn't sleep well," she replied with her thin smile. "My daughter was sick." They searched for Silas Miller for a week. His wife reported him missing on the 3rd day, thinking he had run off with another woman. They combed the area, questioned witnesses. The last time anyone saw him, he was leaving the diner. They found nothing. No body, no clothes, no wallet. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. The mayor, his uncle, personally put pressure on the sheriff's department, but even his power couldn't find something that no longer existed. After 2 months, the case was suspended. Missing person. The neighbors whispered. Probably killed over the stolen cotton. One of his own men got him. Or maybe he just skipped town with the money. Not one person in Harmony Creek suspected the quiet widow with the brick oven. Ruby baked her cornbread, raised her daughter, smiled at her customers, and waited, because Silas was only the first. The death of Silas Miller changed something in Ruby. Or rather, it showed her that the change had already happened, irrevocably and completely. In the first few days after Silas's disappearance, she waited for fear. She expected to jump at every knock on her gate, to be unable to sleep, for her hands to start shaking. None of it happened. She slept soundly, more soundly than she had since November of 1962. Her hands were steady when she kneaded the dough. Her voice was, even when she spoke to customers, she felt as if she had finally pulled out a splinter, one that had been lodged in her heart for 3 years, sharp, festering, making it impossible to live. Justice, that's what it was. Not revenge. Justice. The court hadn't punished her husband's killer, so she had punished him herself. The balance had been restored, but a balance, once broken, never returns to its original state. Ruby began to see the world differently. She saw things she hadn't noticed before, or had noticed but hadn't allowed herself to think about. She saw her neighbor Zelda, a young woman of 25 who had married at 18 and was widowed at 22 when her husband was killed in an accident at the mill. Zelda lived alone in a tiny room in an old house, doing laundry for other people, barely making ends meet. And Ruby saw why Zelda never left her house after dark anymore, why she flinched at loud noises, why she had bruises on her arms that she hid under long sleeves. In 1964, a man named Cletus Hogan had returned from prison. He had been convicted in 1959 for raping a woman. He was given 7 years but got out on parole after 5. He moved in with distant relatives on the next street over. 3 months after his return, Zelda stopped going to the market. The other women brought her food. Ruby understood without a word. She was a woman herself. She knew what the silence of a victim meant. One evening, she went to Zelda's house. bringing fresh, warm cornbread. They sat in the dark of the small room, in silence. Then Zelda began to speak in a whisper, swallowing her words. Cletus had attacked her in the dark, had done things she couldn't bring herself to say out loud. He told her, "If you tell anyone, I'll kill you." And who was there to tell? The sheriff? The same deputy who took bribes at the market? He wouldn't even listen. He'd say she was asking for it. Ruby listened in silence, holding Zelda's hand, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say. Words wouldn't help here. That night, she didn't sleep again. But this time, it wasn't from nightmares, but from thoughts. She thought about justice, about how it was structured in this world, about the laws that protected the powerful and humiliated the weak, about the police who turned a blind eye, about the courts that acquitted, about the authorities who covered for their own. And she thought about the oven, about the 750 degrees, about the ash that was so good for her tomatoes. Cletus Hogan disappeared in October of 1966. He lived alone. His wife had left him while he was in prison. He worked as a loader at the market, drank, and started fights. The neighbors avoided him. The men considered him trash. The women were afraid of him. That Friday evening, he drank more than usual. He got into an argument with a vendor, nearly starting a fist fight. They threw him out of the local tavern. He was walking home through the dark alleys, muttering curses. He was found, or rather, not found. A week later, the owner of his room came for the rent and found the place empty. His things were there, his papers were there, but the man was gone. The police conducted a formal inquiry. An ex-convict, a drunk, a troublemaker. Who cared about him? They decided he had run off to escape his debts or had been killed in a drunken brawl somewhere out of town. They didn't even open a case file. Zelda learned about Cletus's disappearance from the other women. She said nothing. Only for the first time in a year and a half, she left her house in broad daylight. She didn't know what had really happened. Not then. But she began to visit Ruby in the evenings, helping her knead dough and clean the yard. They sat in silence together. It was easier than talking. The third was Deputy Sheriff Earl Jones, 41 years old. He had been assigned to the Hollow since 1958. Officially, he kept the peace. In reality, he collected tribute. Every Friday, he would walk through the market. The vendors, women selling greens, milk, and eggs from their own gardens, paid him $1, sometimes $3. Those who didn't pay would suddenly have violations. Trading without a permit, unsanitary conditions, suspicious goods. It was hardest on the widows. Without husbands, without protection, without money for bribes. Earl knew this and exploited it. Martha Rigsby, Ruby's neighbor, had been widowed in 1960. Her son had been killed in the army, an accident during training. Her husband couldn't bear it and died of a heart attack 6 months later. Martha was left alone at 45 with a small pension and a vegetable garden. She sold tomatoes and greens at the market. Earl took $3 a week from her for protection. Sometimes he would come to her house to check her papers. He behaved in a way that made Martha afraid to be alone with him. She told Ruby about it one day, swallowing tears about how humiliating it was to hand over those dollars, how frightening it was when he came to check on her, how disgusting his stare was, how he degraded her with his words and threats. Ruby listened, nodded, and stroked her neighbor's hand. And that night, again, she did not sleep. In February of 1967, Deputy Earl Jones vanished. He left work on a Friday evening and never came home. His wife filed a report on Monday. They searched for him more seriously than the others. He was a lawman after all. They checked his connections, questioned his debtors, canvassed the taverns. They found his patrol car, parked in its usual spot by the sheriff's office. The trail went cold at the market. After that, nothing. The prevailing theory was a revenge killing. Many people hated Earl. He was a dirty cop, and everyone knew it. They suspected merchants, ex-convicts, jealous husbands. No one suspected the women, the widows, the old, the lonely. They opened a case, investigated for 6 months, and then suspended it. By 1968, Ruby was no longer acting alone. It happened gradually, almost imperceptibly. It started with conversations, quiet, late-night talks over cups of cold coffee. The widows would gather at her house in the evenings. At first, just to sit together, to be silent. Then they began to talk about husbands taken by death or injustice, about sons who never came back from the army, about daughters who were afraid to walk the streets, about the fear that had become a part of their lives, and about the men who created that fear. Martha was the first to learn the truth. She had stopped by Ruby's house at the wrong time, had seen something she wasn't supposed to see, the remnants of a man's clothing, a stain on the ground that shouldn't have been there. Ruby didn't deny it. She looked her neighbor in the eye and told her the truth. The whole truth about Silas, about Cletus, about Earl. Martha was silent for a long time. A minute, 2, 5. Then she said, "Billy Ray Usman, the clerk at the mill office. He's stealing from the widows. My friend gets a survivor's benefit. He takes half of it, says it's for processing fees. We're too scared to complain." It wasn't a question. It was a directive. Ruby nodded. From that day on, there were 2 of them. Zelda joined later, in the spring of 1968. She had suspected for a long time. Women can read each other without words. When Ruby told her the truth about Cletus, Zelda cried. For the first time in years, she cried tears of relief. "I want to help," she said. "It's dangerous. I don't care. After what he did to me, I don't care." Zelda was young and strong. She helped with the things that were difficult for Ruby and Martha. She helped lift, carry, and dispose. There were 3 of them. Miss Elodie May, the old woman who lived on the corner, knew everything from the very beginning. She was 70. She lived alone in a small house by the creek. People came to her for herbal remedies, for advice, for a bit of homespun wisdom. She saw everything from the rocking chair on her porch, and she kept her silence. One day, Ruby went to see her. "You know Miss Elodie," she started. Elodie May just shook her head. "I'm an old woman. My eyes are bad. My ears don't hear so well. I don't know a thing." It was a promise of silence. Elodie helped in her own way. She knew when someone was leaving town, who was sick and staying indoors, who would be at the tavern until closing time. Information that was what she shared. Billy Ray Usman, the clerk, disappeared in May of 1968. Jameson Selby, the son of the very same mayor whose nephew had killed Andrew, disappeared in August of that year. A 28-year-old layabout who liked to grab girls in dark alleys. His father covered up his shenanigans, as he called them. The mayor turned the entire county upside down. They searched for 3 months, combed through every house, every barn, every well. They found nothing, just as they had found nothing before. During those weeks, Ruby baked her cornbread as usual, smiling at her customers. When the investigators came by on their door-to-door search, she offered them coffee and a fresh piece of pie. They thanked her and left. Over 6 years, from 1965 to 1973, 9 men disappeared. Silas Miller, the foreman who killed Andrew. Cletus Hogan, the rapist. Deputy Earl Jones, the crooked cop. Billy Ray Usman, the clerk and thief. Jameson Selby, the mayor's son, and 4 others. Arlo Hodges, Roscoe Turner, Nate Callender, and Bo Yeldell. Each had his own story, his own sin, his own crime for which there was no one to punish them. One foreclosed on widows' homes with forged documents. Another trafficked in teenage boys, selling them as labor to faraway farms. A third ran an illegal gambling den and indebted the local youth. The fourth beat his wife to death, and the investigation ruled it an accidental fall. They all lived in the area. They all enjoyed their impunity. They all believed no court could touch them. They were right. The American court system couldn't touch them. But there was another court, a court that met at night, a quiet court with a sentence from which there was no appeal, a court presided over by 3 widows and an old woman in a rocking chair, a court whose executioner was a 5-foot-deep brick oven. The system was flawless. Miss Elodie gathered information. She knew everything about everyone in the hollow, what they did, where they went, what they said. Old women are invisible in this world. No one pays them any mind. They are trusted with secrets. Martha and Zelda helped choose the moment, watched the target, studied their habits, figured out when the man would be alone, drunk, and vulnerable. Ruby was the executioner. She did it alone, always alone. A blow to the head with something heavy, a rock wrapped in a cloth, a piece of pipe, one precise strike in the dark. Then, a rope around the neck, just to be sure. Quick, quiet, without unnecessary suffering. She was not a sadist. She took no pleasure in it. She did what she felt was necessary. The body was transported in the wheelbarrow, the one she used for flour, through the night streets, through backyards. Ruby had keys to several gates. Neighbors gave out keys in case of fire or sickness or any emergency. The oven worked all night, 750 degrees. Firewood, coals. The smell was like burnt dough, the neighbors would later say. They thought Ruby was experimenting with a new recipe. By morning, only ash remained. It was scattered in the garden. Ash is an excellent fertilizer. Personal effects were destroyed separately. Clothes were burned in the same oven, but on different nights. Papers were burned in the stove inside the house. Metal objects, watches, buckles, coins, were thrown into the creek or buried far from the house. In 6 years, not a single piece of evidence, not a single witness, not a single suspicion. 9 men had vanished into thin air. How did Ruby live during those years? Outwardly, like everyone else, she got up at 4 a.m., kneaded dough, baked, sold her goods, cleaned the house, and worked with her daughter. Daisy was growing up. In 1967, she turned 12. She was a beautiful girl, with her father's eyes and her mother's silent strength. Deaf and mute from birth, she had learned to understand the world in her own way, by reading lips, by expressions, by the vibrations in the floor when someone entered the house. Did she see anything? Did she understand? The investigation would later try to determine this. Daisy slept in her own room. The door was always closed. Ruby protected her daughter from everything, including this. But the girl was not stupid. She noticed that her mother sometimes didn't go to bed at all, that in the morning her mother was tired, even though she said everything was fine, that the oven sometimes smelled different. She never asked. Perhaps she didn't want to know. The years passed. 1,969, 1,970, 1,971. Ruby turned 36, 37, 38. She hardly changed on the outside. The same small figure, the same dark braids under a scarf, the same thin smile. Only her gaze had changed. It had become heavy, impenetrable. The gaze of a person who had seen too much and had gotten used to it. By 1972, the disappearances stopped, not because Ruby had stopped, but because there was no one left to punish. Those who deserved retribution had already received it. Those who remained were ordinary people, weak and sinful, but not monsters. Ruby continued to live, to bake, to raise her daughter. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would gather with Martha and Zelda, silently drinking coffee, silently watching the fire. They rarely spoke of what they had done. It was unnecessary. They understood each other without words. Miss Elodie died in the winter of 1972, quietly, in her sleep, in her little house. They found her 3 days later, when neighbors worried that they hadn't seen smoke from her chimney. She was buried according to tradition. Ruby came to the funeral, stood silently by the grave, and did not cry. She had forgotten how to cry long ago. With Miss Elodie's death, something had ended. The circle was broken. 4 had become 3. But the past doesn't just disappear. It waits for its moment. And in September of 1973, that moment arrived, all because of a drunk man who climbed a fence for a piece of fruit. Before we continue with the investigation, it's important to talk about those who were gone, the 9 men whose lives ended in the clay inferno of a widow's backyard. This is not to justify Ruby's actions. It is to provide context. Without it, the story remains incomplete. Silas Miller, the first victim, 45 years old, foreman of the trucking fleet. He was born in Harmony Creek in 1920. He survived the war, serving stateside. He had a protected status as an essential worker. After the war, he went to work at the textile mill and rose to foreman. Silas was the kind of man who knew how to adapt. When necessary, he smiled at his bosses. When necessary, he crushed his subordinates. He understood the main rule of life in a company town. Connections are everything. His uncle was the mayor. This made Silas untouchable. He beat his wife. Neighbors heard the screams at night. He took bribes. Everyone knew, but they kept quiet. He organized the theft of cotton. The scheme ran for years. When Andrew Vance refused to participate, Silas was enraged. Not by the loss of one driver, but by the defiance. He wasn't used to hearing no. The beating was brutal. 32 blows, the experts counted. Silas did it himself, with no help. He wanted to show what happens to those who disobey. After the murder, he didn't hide. He bragged about it at the tavern, knew his uncle would cover for him, and his uncle did. Silas lived for another 3 years after that, drinking, carousing, stealing, feeling like the king of the world, and then a dark alley, a blow to the head, and a brick oven in a stranger's yard. Cletus Hogan, the second victim, 37 years old, an ex-convict. His story began in 1959. He was a loader at the market, a drunk, and a brawler. One evening, he attacked a girl, a neighbor's 17-year-old daughter. He committed a terrible crime and threatened to kill her if she told. The girl told. Her father went to the police. Cletus was arrested, tried, and given 7 years. He got out in 5 on parole for good behavior. He returned to Harmony Creek, moved in with distant relatives. He worked as a loader, just like before. He drank, just like before. He hadn't changed. Zelda Ahmed suffered at his hands. A young widow, living alone, defenseless. Cletus knew she wouldn't go to the police. He knew no one would protect her. He was wrong. He didn't know about the oven. Deputy Earl Jones, the third victim, 41 years old, a local sheriff's deputy. He had been in law enforcement since 1958. He started out honest, a young idealist who believed in the law. Then the system wore him down. He took his first bribe in 1961, $1 from a vendor to overlook some expired goods. It was so easy, so natural. By 1967, he was collecting tribute from the entire market, $1.35, depending on the business. Those who didn't pay got a citation, a fine, confiscation, their stalls shut down. The widows had it the hardest. They had no husbands to stand up for them, no connections, no money for big bribes. Earl knew this and used it. With Martha, he was especially persistent. He would come to her house under the pretext of checking her papers, humiliate her, threaten her, pressure her. Martha was 52. She was not a beauty, but for a man like Earl, that didn't matter. What mattered to him was power, humiliation, control. One day, he came to her house drunk, demanding submission. She refused. He hit her. 3 months later, he disappeared. Billy Ray Usman, the fourth victim, 53, a warehouse clerk. He managed the finished goods warehouse at the textile mill. Not a high-profile job, but a profitable one. Through his hands passed employee benefits, compensation for the families of the deceased, and financial aid. Billy Ray came up with a simple scheme. He would process the paperwork for the full amount, but give out only half. The difference went into his pocket. Who could they complain to? The mill director? Billy Ray was his fishing buddy. The union? His friends were there. The police? That was Earl Jones, who took bribes himself. The widows received pennies instead of the dollars they were owed. The families of fallen workers barely scraped by. Martha knew 3 such widows. They all complained about Billy Ray, and they all kept quiet. When he disappeared, none of them cried. Jameson Selby, the 5th victim, 28 years old, son of the mayor. He was what you might call company town royalty. His father was a big shot, his mother the principal of the school, an apartment downtown, a car, money. Jameson didn't work. Why would he? His father got him a job as an engineer somewhere, but he only showed up once a month. He drank, played cards, and hunted. The girls in the hollow knew. If you see Jameson, run, hide, don't let him catch you. He loved to scare them in dark alleys, grab their arms, and threaten them. Several girls were assaulted by him. The details are too horrific to repeat. There were several complaints. All of them were dismissed. His father took care of it. After Jameson disappeared, the mayor turned the entire county upside down. They searched for 3 months, interrogated hundreds of people, combed every barn. They found nothing. The mayor never recovered. A year later, he had a stroke. 2 years after that, he was dead. They say he never got over the loss of his son. The irony is, his nephew Silas had also disappeared, and he never learned the truth about that either. The remaining 4, Arlo Hodges, Roscoe Turner, Nate Callender, and Bo Yeldell. Each had his own story, his own sin. Arlo stole houses from widows. He worked in the county records office, forging documents, faking signatures, transferring properties to his name or his associates. The widows and their children were left on the street. Roscoe was a trafficker. He would find work for teenagers from poor families, sending them to distant cotton fields where they worked for food. The money went to him. Nate ran an illegal gambling den. Moonshine, cards, high-stakes games. He addicted the youth, lent them money, then demanded repayment. Those who couldn't pay worked for him. Bo killed his wife. He had beaten her for years. One day, he beat her to death. The investigation ruled it an accident. She fell down the stairs. The neighbors knew the truth, but were too afraid to speak. All of them lived in the area. All were well known, all enjoyed impunity, and all of them disappeared. When investigator Sterling compiled the case file, he checked on every victim. He didn't take anyone's word for it. He verified everything. Silas Miller. In the 1962 case file, witness statements saw him near the tavern that night. The coroner's report described Andrew's injuries. It all added up. The killer was Silas. The case was closed by order from above. Cletus Hogan. Criminal case file from 1959. Sentence: 7 years. Early release in 1964. After his release, 3 complaints of assault against women. All closed for insufficient evidence. Deputy Earl Jones. An excellent service record. But his personnel file contained 8 citizen complaints of extortion. All of them ignored, and so on. Sterling understood that these men were indeed guilty. Ruby had not made a mistake. She killed those whom the law had refused to punish. But that didn't change the facts. Murder is murder. Vigilantism is a crime. Once, during an interrogation, Sterling asked Ruby, "Did you ever think that one of them might have been innocent?" She looked at him for a long time. "I checked each one. I asked questions. I learned things. There wasn't a single innocent man among them. But what if you had been wrong?" "I wasn't wrong. But if you had been?" Ruby was silent. "Then," she finally said, "then that would have been my sin, my answer to God." But I was not wrong. Sterling wrote down this conversation. Years later, he would read it over and over. She was certain, absolutely certain of her righteousness, of her right to judge and punish, of her right to decide who deserved to live and who did not. That was what scared him most of all. To understand how Ruby lived through those years, you have to imagine her day. 4 a.m. It's dark outside. In winter, it's freezing. In summer, the humidity is already thick. She gets up from her cot, puts on an old robe, and goes out into the yard. The brick oven is still warm. She had fired it up the evening before. She needs to stoke it again. Cotton stalks, dry kindling, coal. The fire catches slowly. By 5 a.m., the walls are glowing red hot. She mixed the dough the night before. 40 pounds of flour, a week, water from the well, salt, a pinch of sugar for color. The dough has to rise overnight, become airy, alive. She shapes the cornbread by hand, round and even. With the imprint of her fingers, sprinkles it with sesame seeds and cumin. She slaps the dough onto the hot wall of the oven. It sticks, begins to bubble, and turns a golden brown. By 6 a.m., the first batch is ready. By 7, the customers arrive. Mill workers on their way to the early shift, old men who can't sleep, women who didn't have time to bake their own. Ruby stands at her gate, smiling, wrapping the cornbread in newspaper, taking the money 20 cents apiece and saying, "Thank you, come again." No one sees anything strange about her. An ordinary woman, a widow, a hard worker. By 9 a.m., the selling is done. Ruby cleans the yard, goes to the market for groceries. Daisy is at the special school for deaf children in the county seat. She gets back at 3. The day is spent on chores, cooking, laundry, cleaning. In the evening, dinner with her daughter. Silent, as always. They had learned to understand each other without words long ago. At night, sometimes, there was other work. Not often, once every few months. When everything was ready, the victim chosen, the moment determined, the oven heated. Ruby didn't sleep on those nights. She sat in the yard, tending the fire. By morning, she would clear out the ash, wash the oven walls, and prepare the dough. By 6 a.m., as usual, she was selling cornbread with the same smile, the same words. No one noticed a thing. What did the neighbors say after the arrest? Old man Rahmatullah, 80 years old, who lived 3 houses down. Ruby, a quiet woman, hardworking. Her cornbread was the best in the district. I bought it every morning. I don't believe she. No, I don't believe it. Young Sarah, 25, recently married. We were afraid of her. I don't know why. She always smiled, but her eyes were cold. My mama used to say, "Don't go near her alone." Omar, the owner of the diner on the corner. She never came in. Not once in 10 years. Other women would come in, buy pies for themselves, sit for a bit. Not her. It was like she was afraid of people. Hassan, the mailman who delivered mail to the hollow. She never got any mail. Nothing coming in, nothing going out. Not a single letter in 12 years. It was like she didn't exist to the outside world. They all remembered Ruby. They were all shocked by the news. And all of them, if they thought about it, had seen the signs but had chosen not to see them. That's how people are. We see what we want to see, and the rest we push aside. David Sterling got the call to go to Harmony Creek on the 17th of September 1973. He was 45 years old, a major with the State Bureau of Investigation, a special agent for major crimes. Behind him was the Battle of the Bulge, a shrapnel wound in his leg that still ached in damp weather. After the war, 25 years on the force, murder cases, robberies, embezzlement of public funds. He thought he had seen it all. The call from Harmony Creek put him on edge immediately. "David," the voice of the duty officer trembled. "We've got something strange down here. A woman, an oven. We need someone from the capital. Tell me more. A witness claims he saw 3 women putting something into a large brick oven. At night, we checked it out. The oven is deep, 5 feet. The locals are afraid to dig. Afraid of what? I don't know, Major. But the county sheriff himself asked us to send someone from Montgomery. He said, "This is a bad one." Sterling left the next morning. With him was a young forensic expert, Dr. Victor Peterson, a northerner who had come to Alabama on a state scholarship from a university in Pennsylvania. He was a specialist in bone fragments, 32 years old, thin, bespectacled, with the hands of a surgeon. The drive from Montgomery to Harmony Creek took 6 hours, a dusty highway, heat even in September, the occasional truck loaded with cotton. Sterling looked out the window and thought about the case. A woman, an oven. What could you put in an oven at night? He knew the answer but didn't want to think about it until he saw it with his own eyes. In Harmony Creek, they were met by Deputy Farhad Nazarov, a young local, 26 years old. He looked bewildered. "Major, I don't know what to think. The woman, she's 40 years old, a widow, she bakes cornbread. The whole district knows her. This is impossible." "What exactly is impossible?" "That she, well, women don't do things like that." Sterling said nothing. He knew women did many things. In the war, he had seen female partisans who slit German throats without flinching. He had seen medics who finished off wounded enemies. He had seen mothers who smothered their own children to keep them from crying and giving away their position. Women were people, just like men, capable of anything. They saw Ruby Vance's house from a distance. The stone wall, the blue shutters, the peach tree in the yard. An ordinary house in an ordinary neighborhood. The yard was cordoned off. Locals crowded behind the rope, whispering among themselves. When they saw the car with state license plates, they fell silent. Earl Pritchett, the witness, was at the sheriff's station, shaking as if he had a fever. In 3 days, he had aged 10 years. "Tell me again," Sterling asked, slowly, in detail. Earl told him about the peaches, the fence, and what he saw in the moonlight. 3 women. 3. Ruby, Martha, and Zelda. "I know them, sir. They're neighbors." "What exactly were they doing?" Earl swallowed hard. They were holding something long, wrapped in a blanket. They were lowering it into the oven. Slowly, carefully. "Are you sure about what you saw?" "I was drunk, sir, but I saw it. I saw it." Sterling nodded and dismissed the witness. Then he turned to Dr. Peterson. "Victor, let's get to digging." The excavation began the next morning. The oven was old. Ruby had been using it for more than 10 years. A clay oven, 5 feet deep, the walls scorched black with soot. Peterson worked carefully, layer by layer. Ash, charcoal, baked clay. By the evening of the first day, they found the first piece. "Major, you look at this. You look at this." Sterling walked over. In the expert's hand was something small and charred. "A button," Peterson said. "Metal, American-made, from the 1960s. A button could have fallen in by accident. It could have, but this couldn't have." Peterson held out another object, the remains of a wristwatch. The face was melted, but the case was intact. A Victory model. Sterling identified it. A man's watch. They looked at each other. They both understood. "Keep digging," the major said. Over the next 3 days, they found 7 buttons of various sizes and styles, the remains of 3 wristwatches, a Victory, a Vostok, a racket of 2 belt buckles, a metal comb, the remains of a dental bridge, 5 teeth with metal fillings characteristic of American dentistry from the 1950s and 60s, and bone fragments, charred, brittle, but recognizable to a specialist. Peterson worked in silence, focused. Sterling looked at the growing collection of findings and felt a chill creep up his spine. 5 teeth, a minimum of 5 different people, and judging by the other findings, there were more. "How many?" he asked Peterson on the 4th day. The expert took off his glasses and cleaned them. Based on the remains, a minimum of 6 or 7 individuals, maybe more. The temperature was high. Most of it was completely incinerated. What we found are fragments that survived by chance. They fell to the sides, away from the hottest part of the fire. 6 or 7 people. Minimum. Sterling thought about the missing persons cases from the last few years. There were more, many more. Ruby was arrested on September 20th. She didn't resist. She stood in the yard, watching them tear apart her oven, and said nothing. A thin smile never left her face. When Sterling read her rights and announced her arrest, she only nodded. "My daughter," she said. "Daisy, she's 18. She's deaf and mute. Please, take care of her." Those were her first words the entire time. Daisy stood by the wall of the house. She couldn't hear anything, but she saw everything. Her eyes were dry. She looked at her mother without expression, without tears, without fear. Sterling would later think about that gaze for a long time. What did the girl know? What did she understand? What had she seen over the years? He would never find out. Daisy couldn't speak, and what she knew, she took with her. The first interrogation took place that same day. Ruby sat across from Sterling, thin, calm, her hands folded in her lap. They were calloused hands, the hands of a woman who had worked her whole life. "Tell me about what we found in your oven," Sterling began. "What exactly do you want to know? Whose remains are they?" Ruby was silent for a moment, then began to speak, calmly, deliberately, as if reciting a recipe. She named them all 9. The dates, the circumstances, the reasons. Sterling wrote, not looking up. He was afraid that if he looked at her, he wouldn't be able to continue. When she finished, he asked, "Why?" For the first time during the interrogation, Ruby looked him straight in the eye. "You know who killed my husband, don't you? Silas Miller, the first on your list." "Yes." "And you know what was done about it?" "Nothing. The case was closed." "Exactly. Nothing. He killed Andrew, beat him to death, and walked free. He laughed, drank whiskey, lived his life." She paused. "The court didn't punish him," she continued. "The police didn't punish him. The mayor didn't punish him. No one punished him. So I did. And the others? The others deserved the same. Rapists, thieves, murderers. The ones the law wouldn't touch. The ones who hid behind their connections, their money, their positions. You judged them yourself? Someone had to." Sterling put down his pen. "You understand that this is murder?" 9 murders. Ruby nodded. "I understand. I am ready to answer for it. You could face the electric chair?" "I know." She said it so calmly that Sterling flinched. Martha Rigsby and Zelda Ahmed were arrested the same day. Both confessed immediately. They didn't deny anything, didn't try to make excuses. They told him everything. Who did what, who tracked whom, who helped with the bodies. Sterling interrogated them one by one, looking for contradictions, inconsistencies, lies. He found none. 3 women, 3 widows, 3 people broken by life who had found their own way to get back at the world. When asked why, all 3 answered the same way. They deserved it. The investigation lasted 4 months. Peterson worked with the remains, identifying them by teeth, by old medical records, by descriptions from relatives. Of the 9 victims, they managed to identify 7. 2 remained unknown. There was almost nothing left of them. Sterling reconstructed the timeline, gathered witness statements from those who saw the missing men for the last time, those who noticed something strange in the women's behavior, those who remembered details. A terrifying picture emerged. 9 murders in 6 years. A system that worked like clockwork. Women who chose their victims so carefully that they never once targeted an innocent person. An oven that completely destroyed the evidence. If it hadn't been for the drunk Earl and his craving for someone else's peaches, they could have continued for years, maybe until their own deaths. Deputy Nazaroff, the young local officer, once asked Sterling a question. "Major, do you think they were right?" "About what?" "Well, the men they killed, were they really that bad?" Sterling was silent for a long time. Silas Miller, a murderer protected by power. Cletus Hogan, a rapist released on parole. Earl Jones, a crooked cop in a uniform. Billy Ray Usman, a thief who stole from widows. Jameson Selby, the mayor's son, a rapist. And 4 others, each with his own sin. They were all guilty of what the women accused them of. Sterling had checked thoroughly. The rumors were confirmed. The testimonies matched. These men were indeed what Ruby believed them to be. But he was an investigator, a representative of the law, and the law did not give private citizens the right to punish. "They are guilty of murder," he finally said. "That's all that matters." Nazarov nodded, but a shadow of doubt remained in his eyes. Sterling saw that doubt and understood it, because he felt the same thing himself. The case was sent to trial in January 1974. By order of the Alabama Supreme Court, the trial was declared closed to the public. The official reason was to protect public order. The real reason was that it raised too many uncomfortable questions. Why wasn't Silas Miller prosecuted for the murder of Andrew Vance? Why did Deputy Jones take bribes for years without anyone intervening? Why did the mayor's son rape girls with impunity? These questions were not meant to be aired in open court. The establishment protected its reputation. The trial began on the 15th of February 1974 in the Harmony Creek County Courthouse. The courtroom was small. Closed sessions didn't require space for the public. A judge, a prosecutor, a defense attorney, bailiffs, a stenographer, and 3 women in the defendant's box. Ruby Vance looked calm, 40 years old, thin, with gray streaks in her black hair that hadn't been there a year ago. She sat up straight, looking ahead, barely reacting to the proceedings. Martha Rigsby, 55, looked older than her years, hunched over with trembling hands. She cried quietly, soundlessly, not wiping away the tears. Zelda Ahmed, 31, a beautiful woman, even after months in jail. She stared at the floor and remained silent. The prosecutor read the indictment. 9 counts of murder, committed by a group with premeditation, with extreme cruelty, and with concealment of the bodies. The articles of the Alabama Criminal Code sounded dry, bureaucratic. Behind each line was a human life. 9 lives. The defense attorney, an old local lawyer appointed by the state, did what he could. He asked the court to consider the circumstances that drove the women to their crimes. He spoke of the injustice they had experienced, of a system that had failed to protect them. The judge listened patiently, then asked a question. "Do the defendants plead guilty?" Ruby stood up first. "Yes, I plead guilty to all charges." "Do you have any remorse for your actions?" She paused. The courtroom held its breath. "I did what I had to do. They murdered my husband. They destroyed the lives of our women. They robbed our widows. The law didn't touch them. I touched them. That is not an answer to the question. Do you have any remorse?" Ruby looked the judge straight in the eye. "No." Martha said the same thing. Her voice trembled, but her words were firm. "No, I have no remorse." Zelda was silent longer than the others, then said quietly, "Cletus destroyed my life. For years, I was afraid to go outside, afraid of the dark, afraid of people. When he disappeared, I took my first deep breath. Do you have any remorse?" "No." The prosecutor demanded the death penalty for all 3. "Your Honor," he said, "before you are not just murderers. Before you is an organized criminal group that acted with cold-blooded, calculated precision. For 6 years, his women selected victims, planned their crimes, and destroyed the evidence. They arrogated to themselves the right to judge and punish. That right belongs only to the state." He paused. "It doesn't matter what their victims were like. It doesn't matter what they did. In this country, we have a court, we have a law, and we have agencies charged with protecting it. Vigilantism is a return to barbarism. It is a crime against the very foundations of our society. I demand the death penalty for Ruby Vance as the organizer and primary perpetrator. I demand the death penalty for Martha Rigsby and Zelda Ahmed as active accomplices. The defense attorney spoke of mitigating circumstances, that Ruby had lost her husband and received no justice, that Zelda had been a victim of violence and was not protected, that Martha had lost her son and her husband. These women are not criminals by nature, he argued. They became what they are because the system failed them, because those who were supposed to protect did not protect, because those who were supposed to punish did not punish. The judge listened impassively. That is not a justification for murder, he said. The law is the same for everyone. The verdict was announced on the 28th of February 1974. Ruby Vance, guilty on all counts. The sentence is death by electrocution. Martha Rigsby, guilty. The sentence is death by electrocution. Zelda Ahmed, guilty. The sentence is death by electrocution. The sentence is final and not subject to appeal. Ruby heard the verdict standing. She did not flinch, did not turn pale. She only gave a short nod, as if agreeing with something obvious. Martha fainted. The bailiffs carried her out. Zelda cried for the first time during the entire trial. Quietly, soundlessly, like people who have no strength left. The sentence was carried out in April 1974 at Holman Correctional Facility, as was standard for such cases. No relatives were present. No newspaper wrote about it. No documents were ever unsealed. 3 women left the world as quietly as they had lived in it, without noise, without fame, without a legacy. What was left behind? Daisy Vance, Ruby's daughter. After her mother's arrest, she was taken to a special residential school for the deaf. She was 18 years old, a beautiful, silent girl with eyes that had seen too much. The investigation tried to question her through an interpreter, through written notes. She didn't answer a single question. She would shake her head, gesture. I don't know, I didn't see, I don't understand. Did Sterling believe her? No. He was sure she knew. Maybe not everything, but a lot. But it was impossible to prove. A deaf-mute witness who refuses to speak, what can you do? Daisy was not charged. She graduated from the school, then a sewing college. She married a deaf man from another town. She had 2 children and lived a quiet, unremarkable life. She died in 2015. She was 60 years old. Neither of her children ever knew that their maternal grandmother had been executed as a serial killer. Some secrets die with the people who keep them. Major Sterling returned to Montgomery after the trial. He served for another 8 years and retired in 1982. They say he never forgot the case. In his later years, he often talked about it with friends, family, and former colleagues. Not as a professional achievement, but as a question that remained unanswered. They were murderers, he would say. That's undeniable. But the men they killed, were they any better? Rapists, thieves, killers whom the law didn't touch. What is a person to do when the law doesn't work? He never found an answer and died in 1995, still searching. Deputy Nazarov, the young assistant, rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel and headed a sheriff's department in another county. He married, raised 3 children. He also remembered the case. One day, many years later, he confessed to his wife, "You know what still bothers me? I'm not sure we did the right thing. You caught the killers, didn't you?" "Yes, we did. But the men they killed, they should have been caught too, a long time before. And they weren't." Dr. Victor Peterson, the forensic expert, returned to Pennsylvania in 1980. He wrote his doctoral dissertation on the identification of charred remains, based on the materials from the Harmony Creek case, of course, without names or details. He became a professor, gave lectures, wrote textbooks. He He never publicly mentioned the Vance case. But to students who asked about the most difficult, that's all I can say. Ruby's house was demolished in 1985. New development, a new neighborhood, new people. The brick oven was filled in, the peach tree cut down, but the old-timers remembered. They called that alley Oven Lane. They told their children and grandchildren in whispers, looking over their shoulders as if afraid someone might hear. Don't go down there at night. A woman lived there who baked cornbread out of, well, you know. The children didn't know. The grandchildren, even less so. The story turned into a legend, the legend into a folktale, the folktale into nothing. But the smell, the old-timers say, still appears sometimes on still, moonless nights. The smell of burnt dough, or something like it. I've told you the story of Ruby Vance, the woman who baked the best cornbread in the district, and the woman who killed 9 men. What do you think of her? That's a question I leave to you. Was she a monster? Possibly. 9 lives are 9 lives. No matter who those men were. Was she a victim? Also possible. A system that didn't protect her? A law that didn't punish her husband's killer? A society that looked the other way? Or was she both? A victim who became an executioner? A person who crossed the line because the line was the only way out? I don't know the answer. Sterling didn't know. The judge who passed the sentence probably had his doubts too. But there are some things I know for sure. Andrew Vance was murdered in 1962. His killer was never punished. That is a fact. The 9 men killed by Ruby were guilty of crimes. Rape, theft, murder crimes the law ignored. That is also a fact. And here is one more fact. When the law doesn't work, people find their own ways. Terrible, illegal, inhuman ways. But their own. This is not a justification, it's an explanation. The story of Ruby Vance lay in sealed archives for 50 years. The not-for-public disclosure stamp was only removed in 2020. Why? Because this story asks uncomfortable questions about a government that covers for its own, about a law that is selective, about a justice that exists only on paper. These questions were uncomfortable in 1974. They are uncomfortable now, but they must be asked. If you've listened to the end, it means this story has touched something inside you. Maybe you thought about your parents, your grandparents, those who lived in that time and those places among those people. Maybe you recognize something familiar, the smell of cornbread at dawn, the heat of a brick oven, the silence of a small southern town. Maybe you've started to think about justice, the kind written in law books, and the kind that lives in the human heart. Thank you for being with me. This story is for you, for those who remember, and for those who want to know. Subscribe to the channel if you want to hear more stories from the past. Stories the newspapers never wrote about. Stories that were kept in sealed archives. Stories that deserve to be heard.